such in our studios in Delhi. Srinath, how much of this is symbolism? I mean, he has made it quite clear, if you go through his statement just before he was taking off from Washington, that the focus is on creating jobs back home. So what does that entail for us, Srinath?
Well, the economic issues are primarily the issues which are, in the short term, most important for the United States. We've seen how the elections have panned out, and the White House assessment is that the elections were lost primarily because the administration was not able to turn the economy around in the last 2 years. So, to that extent, the fact that creation of more jobs and opportunities for American businesses in India and vice versa is on the top of President Obama's agenda is not surprising. But what are we really looking at? And I think there are at least two levels in which we need to understand what are the kind of economic issues that are likely to be important for the United States. The first are those issues where the United States would want first-time entry into the Indian market, which includes things like agriculture, things like dairy products, and of course retail. And there are another set of issues where the Americans already have a leg in and would like to expand their presence. This includes sectors like banking, financial services, insurance, and of course defense and nuclear issues, which are now very much in the limelight. But over and beyond the issue of bilateral trade and so on, there is the issue of America's sort of growing trade deficit with other countries in the world, particularly with China. And we've seen how the United States has been urging China to sort of make sure its currency valuation reflects the underlying fundamentals of trade relationships, that is, the yuan should go up, and thereby make American exports more competitive as well. And that is an area where the Americans have been trying to drum up some degree of support. The United States is looking to bring up this issue in a major way in the forthcoming G20 summit in Seoul. And I'm sure President Barack Obama will want to consult extensively with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh on how best to convince China to make sure that its currency appreciates and that the trade deficit which the United States currently has with China can be managed to America's benefit. On the Indian side, I think what we are looking at primarily is on lifting export restrictions which the Americans have in place for a variety of technological high technology, sort of dual-use technology regimes which are in place, and that, from the Indian perspective, will be the most important thing on the agenda.
Right. Is that likely to happen? Let me get C. Raghavan. Welcome. Good morning. Raghavan, do you think that's going to happen? Lifting of export control restrictions that have been there. Will Obama make that announcement, or will we take some steps in that direction?
I think he will take some steps in the direction.
Be a focus on specifics right now. I mean, Obama seems to be focusing 60% on cosmetics here, 40% on specifics. That also specifics that suit him. But others will focus on specifics, and this time it will be a more assertive India that we speak. Srinath, your views? We ran into a debate here when we mentioned the UN Security Council seat, but that's not the only issue.
I think there is a case to be made that in many ways the problem with US-India relations today is that we are really not talking hard-headed realism and specific issues in a more forthright fashion. And unless and until we start doing that, we really cannot give real content to this partnership in any sense of the word. To put it sort of very bluntly, I think the India-US honeymoon, which we saw in the Bush period, is over. And it's a good thing that it's over, because most good relationships cannot last in the honeymoon phase forever. And the important thing for us is to see how is it that we can move on to dealing with issues where we have converging interests, as well as issues where we do not have a coincidence of interest, but which nevertheless need to be sorted out. And the case of the UN Security Council seat, for instance, is one of those. I think the larger issue is not about the Americans worrying whether China is going to veto an Indian application for a seat at the Security Council. The larger issue is, what is the American view about the reform of the Security Council system itself? And this in some ways goes back to the debates over the 2003 Iraq war. Because it was then that became quite clear to the Americans that even some of their old established traditional allies like the French could go against them if they believed that American actions were not in the wider international interest. And it is those sorts of experiences which have given pause to the Americans in terms of thinking about UN Security Council reform. No US administration can afford to take New Delhi stances for granted.
Yeah.
And having one more player on the table with one more veto is going to create extra complications. And it is these sorts of issues that we need to have a straightforward talk with them. We need to understand what their views about UN Security Council reforms are. What are their concerns? How is it that these concerns can be handled? And ultimately, I think, unless and until we really start talking about specifics, the feel-good factor can go on forever, but the relationship will lack content unless and until we get down to talking on specific issues.
Sure. I think we are getting rebuts coming in. Raja wants to rebut. Go on, Raja. You spark the debate.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Srinath's metaphor of honeymoon. Honeymoon always gets over pretty quickly. Then the humdrum of marriage begins, which is how do you create the workman-like relationship? How do you create conditions where the large parts of your two systems can actually work together? So I think we are concentrated at this phase on this getting the two systems to work together. So I think the UN Security Council is so far away, reform of it, given the Chinese opposition to it. I don't think we should waste too much time on it. The more immediate questions are, who is going to run the security in the Indian Ocean? How are we going to manage the new challenges in the South China Sea? These are more immediate issues, and I think in the near-term issues that we need to work together.
Okay. There are several issues. Security Council not the only one. I want to go to Mr. Stope Talbot once more. On the other big sticking issue, Mr. Talbot, as far as the civil nuclear liability bill is concerned. Now, this is something that seems to be worrying the Americans. My question to you is, do you think Obama will bring that up? If so, in what form? And why is there so much unhappiness in America with the bill when the French and the Russians don't seem to have too many problems with it?
Is the most important and most confounding strategic problem for the United States. And I think we have to be realistic in understanding their importance which they attach to Pakistan at this stage, and not to hype our expectations too much. Why are we expecting that the Americans will do our job for us? We have to learn to deal with Pakistan ourselves. Of course, we expect that the Americans will apply a certain degree of pressure, but then that will happen at a time and place of their choosing, not ours.
Right.
And to that extent, I think we just need to be realistic.
Okay, ahead of that meeting at Trident Hotel, Srinath Raghavan and Charles Sevinger, of course, will be talking about the issue, apart from the principal one which we would like him to speak about, which is energy cooperation between India and the US. I want to take up the issue of energy cooperation.
Is that simply pushing for the appreciation of the yuan is not going to make American exports more competitive. The Chinese competitiveness stems from a number of factors. The undervaluation of the yuan is going to be one of them. There are a number of other things which the Americans cannot address in the short term. It's going to be a much longer game that we have to take. The second thing, that as Mr. Iyer said, the American idea, which Timothy Geithner sort of gave a guide some time ago of saying that let's try and put a number, 4% cap on some trade surpluses which any country can enjoy, is not likely to have much traction in the G20. I think it would be foolish on our part to place ourselves on the side of the Americans. American companies, the kind of protection that they are seeking here in India.
Yep.
And that to me is a fundamentally discriminatory way of going about doing things. American system is based on the principle of unlimited liability. The 3 Mile Island, when the cases happen, the suppliers will have no problem. So how can we expect to do that? The other important thing, against the backdrop of which this bill was passed, was the whole BP oil spill which happened with us.
I just want to cut you off.
25 nuclear reactors in the years ahead. This is a major expansion. This is where the new market is. And how many reactors have the Americans built in the last 20 years? None. In fact, their projects in China are getting delayed.
That's the point.
So clearly their expertise in this area is not strong enough. If they feel that they cannot enter in this market and compete on equal terms with the French and the Russians, so be it.
Absolutely. I think you've said it there. The only lifeline to the Westinghouses and the other corporations in this area is India. They don't have a choice. They do not have negotiating room. And I think, Srinath, you put it spot on. You ask anyone from the power sector here in India what they think about American nuclear companies doing projects in India concerned, they're going to ask you, just check out how many power projects have started in America. There are environmental concerns over it. There are other contentious issues over it. America does not have nuclear power generation, magnified in a massive way over the last 2 decades. You've been spot on this. Mahesh wanted to add a point.
No, I think the 3 Mile Island reference is important.
I think this is followed by the joint press conference, and with 4 questions, it's over. So I think some specific questions need to be asked. We can quickly recap on this fundamental point. Srinath, you've been waiting a long time on this. If this is what we achieve on Pakistan, have we achieved enough?
See, I mean, I agree with what Mr. Iyer is saying, which is that the Americans have their view on Pakistan, that we have different views, but then the fundamental purpose of diplomacy is to be able to reconcile conflicting interests.
Yeah.
And if you are unable to do it, then the purpose of having these meetings is not going to be served at all. And I think in looking at what is happening, we need to understand two things. One is the drafting of the joint statement, which is an act of public diplomacy. Okay, maybe there are certain things that can be left out. But the key thing is, what is the meat of the discussion? Are we trying to tell the Americans that can we hold them to their own standards? Can we try and suggest to them that by their own benchmarks, which were laid out by the Obama administration, how far progress will be made?
Absolutely.
And let us also remember that ultimately the United States government is not simply the administration. There is also the US Congress.
Yeah.
So the Congress that these undertakings have been given, the Indians should learn to play the American system more broadly than just relying on imploring presidential.
I also have a bit of news which came in from our reporter Sanket on the ground, Chidana. I want you to
Point Mahesh made earlier about President Obama's comments about the revaluation of the Chinese yuan, and which, as you rightly said, he was more or less speaking for the Indian Prime Minister. Now, the interesting thing is that the last time the Americans found themselves in a similar position, where they wanted their competitors to devalue their currency, was in the mid-1980s with Germany and Japan, which they pushed through in the plaza. But the Germany and Japan, of course, were their key allies. China is not. So he needs support of countries like India in order to be able to move away.
I have a question here, bigger question I'm putting across, and that's the conundrum of the day.
Between India and the United States here. So on both counts, I think it's something that the Indians will very strongly welcome.
No, there were a lot of people who had said that we should not expect him to say, name Pakistan, because that is something that will compromise American strategic interests. And we here at Times have always consistently maintained, Srinath, that there is no inconsistency in mentioning the fact it's a global fact, a well-known reality that Pakistan is where safe havens exist. But why do you think he ended up proving so many people wrong? Why did he prove so many? What made Obama come out there and prove so many people wrong today with the simplicity with which he said what we have always been saying, that safe havens exist in Pakistan?
There are at least sort of two things at work here. One is, if you look at the way the whole visit has been panning out, from his very first interview to the PTI before he left the United States, he kept expectations low. And then each new announcement has been coming in at a different stage. So at every stage of his visit, there has always been something that he has given to India, or something that he has pushed to demonstrate his commitment to making this partnership strong. And I think possibly at one level, it could be that he was reserving this particular statement for the Parliament, because of the symbolism that it would have when it came from the Parliament, as opposed to coming elsewhere, say at St. Xavier's or some other such venue. The second thing, of course, is I think his own team would have realized, because they have been looking at Indian responses to this thing very closely. They have a media center which is traveling with them. And I think they've certainly taken on board this fact that without a strong statement of one kind or the other, they simply could not get away with sort of being equivocal about this one way or the other. And I think they would have just done a straightforward analysis of what the costs and benefits are.
Yes.
Surely the Pakistanis will be upset. They will have their own complaints, but those will be dealt with in due course in diplomatic channels. I think the Americans understood that while here in India, it is important to address this particular core security concern. And if you notice, in his speech, one of the three cornerstones that he lays out for US-India relationships is security. So when he's placing so much emphasis on that particular aspect, to not talk anything at all about Pakistan or about the sources of terrorism, more importantly, rather than Pakistan, would have been very incongruous.
I think his speech is so refreshing, because sometimes people get carried away in stereotypes, and unfortunately even mentioning Pakistan's support to terror during a summit as this is seen as a spoiler. It's seen as hawkish. Well, by that definition, Barack Obama is a hawk.
But I think,
Mahesh, but clearly the truth and the reality of it stares even Obama in the face.
Now, I think we must emphasize, this was vintage Barack.